Most listeners of Unsolved Mysteries have at least one mystery they wish they knew the answer to. But sometimes having an answer to that mystery can take away from what made it so interesting in the first place. In other cases, the mystery only gets even more confusing, as the answer doesn't quite leave every question solved. But neither of these endings make the story any less interesting. Number 5. A lot of unsolved mysteries, especially historical mysteries, relate to lost treasure. Over thousands of years, countless pieces of art or precious metals have been lost. Some are buried with the intention of being recovered later. Others are accidentally lost in shipwrecks or other disasters. It's rare that a treasure is deliberately lost with the intention of someone else finding the mystery, but that was the case with Forrest Fenn's treasure. The Fenn treasure captured the imagination of hundreds of people. It was a treasure hunt that went on for more than a decade. At some points, it looked like the mystery of the treasure would never be solved, and Fenn would take the secret to the grave. But in June of 2020, a post was made to Fenn's blog revealing that the treasure had been found. Forrest Fenn was a former US Air Force pilot and art dealer who was born in 1930. He served in the Vietnam War. His plane was struck down twice, but he managed to survive the conflict and was awarded the Silver Star. After returning to the United States, he settled down in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he raised his family and started an art gallery. Fenn always had an interest in art, particularly Native American pieces. According to his family, he loved the ancient lore that surrounded the art. He wouldn't get into the business himself until 1972, and was guided by Rex Aerosmith. But once he started, Fenn found a lot of success. The gallery attracted celebrities like Jacqueline Kennedy and Ralph Lauren. There were rumors that Fenn had been getting his artwork by illegally plundering ancient Native American pueblos. An investigation by authorities found no evidence of illegal activity. In 1988, Fenn was diagnosed with cancer, with the prognosis that it was terminal. He began thinking about his own passing, what he would leave behind, and how he wanted it to go. It was then that the idea of the treasure hunt would begin to form. Thankfully, Fenn recovered from the illness, but kept the idea of a treasure hunt. The hunt wouldn't start until 2010. That year, he published the book The Thrill of the Chase, which featured a 24-line poem. He then announced the treasure hunt. He had hidden a Roman-esque bronze chest somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. It was filled with gold coins and other valuables estimated to be worth roughly $2 million. He revealed few clues other than it was in the Rocky Mountains at an elevation of between 5,000 and 12,000 feet, and that he had brought it to that location himself in 2 trips, and that there were 10 hidden clues in the poem in his book. Initially, there were only a few people searching for the treasure, but the strange mystery caught the attention of a few national news outlets, and suddenly there were hundreds of people searching for the treasure. Fenn's aim in starting the treasure hunt had been to get people outdoors, which he achieved successfully. People met online and in person to discuss the treasure, and to try to track the clues as to where it was hidden. People searched alone, with friends, or as part of family outings. For the most part, the treasure hunting was a positive experience, but there were several controversial occurrences. One person broke into the home of Fenn's daughter, believing the treasure was hidden there. Fenn's family was threatened. A few people were arrested for illegal camping or digging in protected areas. Fenn always warned people to be careful and reminded searchers that he had taken the treasure there himself. It wouldn't be somewhere where an 80-year-old man couldn't get to. That didn't stop some people from taking risks. 5 people lost their lives while searching the Rocky Mountains for Fenn's treasure. At one point, Fenn was asked to call off the treasure hunt by New Mexico authorities, but he refused. He pointed out that any outdoor activity had risks. On June 6, 2020, Fenn announced on his blog that the treasure had been found. Lots of people were disappointed, not only because the hunt had ended, but because Fenn wouldn't reveal where the location actually was. Even the identity of the finder was kept a secret. 3 months later, Fenn passed away at the age of 90. The story of Fenn's treasure continued to attract controversy. One woman alleged that the finder had hacked into her phone to get the solution to Finn's poem that she had come up with. She had filed a lawsuit against Finn before he passed away, and now looked set to try to file a suit against his family. This prompted the finder, a man named Jack Stuff, to come forward. Jack was a former writer and a medical student. He first heard of Finn's treasure in 2018 and quickly became obsessed, like so many others had. Many people believed that the poem was actually a riddle that needed to be solved, and saw the hunt as a puzzle. Jack believed that the poem was more literal. He told Outside Magazine that it was best suited for an English literature student. Solving the clues to find Finn's treasure was about getting the right meaning out of the poem, and trying to understand what Finn meant by every word. Jack focused only on the words Finn said and wrote. One of the important clues was that Finn said he imagined lying down and passing away beside the treasure. It was somewhere where Finn felt at peace. Jack pieced together his own solve of the puzzle in 2018. He's never revealed exactly where the poem took him, only that it was somewhere in Yellowstone National Park, and that the treasure wasn't buried. It was just covered in some leaves, but the lid was still visible. It took 25 days of searching, over 3 years, before he finally found the treasure. He then took the treasure to Santa Fe to have it confirmed by Finn. Some believe that Jack had more knowledge than what Finn had made publicly available. One treasure hunter alleged that Finn had told Jack specifically where to look. Given how close the finding of the treasure was to when Finn passed away, it seemed to line up nicely for a perfect ending to the story. Jack denies this and says that he never had spoken to Finn before he found the treasure. Another lawsuit might reveal exactly where the treasure was found. A man from Florida named Jamie McCracken claimed that he had solved the mystery of Finn's treasure first, but Finn moved the chest before McCracken could get it. Finn said before he passed away that Jack had found the treasure in the same location where Finn had buried it in 2010, but that might not stop the case from going to court. If it does, Jack may have to reveal the location to prove that the treasure had been there all along. Jack's reason for keeping the location a secret is simple. It was an important location to Finn, and Yellowstone staff have confirmed that it wouldn't be suitable for a large amount of foot traffic. If he revealed the location, it might become a pilgrimage spot for former treasure hunters, and ruin what Finn found so special in the first place. The mystery may not have been solved in quite the same way many treasure hunters had hoped for, but that only helps to keep the story alive. The solution also gives hope that some of the other lost treasures may one day be found. Number 4. It's human nature to make up stories to explain things that we don't understand. Weird but natural occurrences would often be attributed to some god or other paranormal being. When our scientific knowledge of the world is finally able to explain these strange occurrences, the stories become nothing more than folklore. But sometimes we outgrow the stories before our scientific understanding catches up. Without the divine explanation, we're left scratching our heads until the mystery is solved. The Mudas Noises date back to pre-Columbian times. They originate in what today is Connecticut, in the area around Mount Tom. The local people called the area the place of bad noises. Low rumbling sounds could occasionally be heard. Sometimes they were one-off rumbles, while other times swarms would hit for months at a time. The noises were described as being like thunder, a shot, or crashing coming from underground. For the Native Americans, it was the voice of the god Hobomuk. Hobomuk was an evil or macabre trickster spirit in local beliefs. Some believe he lived under Mount Tom, and the noises were his messages to the local people. When English settlers arrived in the area, they also heard the strange noises. They were given the name Mudas Noises, and the name Mudas was later given to a town in the area. The English initially attributed the noises to their god. They wrote about how the sound caused the houses to shake, and one priest described it as a reminder from God to be humble. At the same time, the Native Americans still believed that the noises came from Hobomuk, and told Europeans that he was upset that their god had come with them. Later, the Europeans claimed that the Native Americans were doing deals with the devil, and the Mudas Noises were a result. Over the centuries, the myths surrounding the Mudas Noises seemed to follow whatever panic was happening at the time. It would later be attributed to witches who were fighting in a cavern underneath the mountain or in a nearby cave. and in the 1960s was attributed to the devil again. Later news reports would bring up stories of ghosts. Some suggested Dr. Steele had never left the area and was still making the noises. Others blamed the ghost of musicians. There was a similarity between the noise and drums. Not everybody believed the Mudas Noises were something spiritual, even in early colonial times. One more scientific theory suggested that there was some kind of tunnel that connected the mountain to the nearby sea. The Mudas Noises were just the sound of waves and sea wind echoing through that tunnel. Another theory suggested it came from underground gases. A later scientific theory suggested that a stream under the mountain was eroding part of the walls or the ceiling, and that the noise was the result of falling rocks. In 1790, a man named Dr. Steele entered the story. Some versions of the tale claimed that he was an alchemist sent by King George III himself. He had heard of the Mudas Noises and knew what caused them: a carbuncle or large red gemstone deep under the earth. He set up in a blacksmith's workshop and worked in complete secrecy. One night, a cloud of smoke arose from the workshop, along with flames and sparks. Steele then said that he had found and removed the large carbuncle. There was still a smaller one down under the crust, but it wouldn't cause the same loud rumbling noises as the first carbuncle. He then left town and was never heard from again. Whether or not Dr. Steele was a real person, he didn't solve the problem. The noises did originate from something underground, but it wouldn't be until the 1980s that scientists were able to say for certain what it was. Many of the Mudas Noises, especially the loudest ones, seemed to make the earth shake. There was also a strange pattern around earthquakes. On October 29, 1727, an earthquake shook New England. It was the largest one since the European settlers had arrived in the area and was felt everywhere from Maine to Connecticut. After the Great Earthquake, the Mudas Noises stopped for a while. A few decades later, in 1791, there was another large earthquake, this one measuring between 4.5 and 5 on the Richter scale. For a short time afterwards, there were aftershocks, and those came with deafening noises. It wasn't surprising that scientists believed the Mudas Noises probably had something to do with seismic activity. The US East Coast isn't anywhere near as seismically active as the West Coast, but the ancient faults that formed at the same time as the Appalachian Mountains can still reactivate from time to time. In the late 1970s, scientists from the Weston Observatory of Boston College set up 6 seismic stations around where the Mudas Noises were heard to try to test the theory that earthquakes were behind the noise. The stations were incredibly sensitive, able to record events as weak as -2 on the Richter scale. Those would be 100 times less powerful than an earthquake that reached 1 on the Richter scale. It took years, but finally, in August of 1981, the Mudas Noises returned. At the same time, the extremely sensitive seismographs recorded 177 events and 400 smaller disturbances. The largest of these only reached a level 2. In June of 1982, there was another swarm of these microscopic earthquakes, with the most powerful being a 2.9. At the same time that these swarms were recorded, people reported hearing the Mudas Noises. After years of studying these tiny tremors and the correlating Mudas Noises, scientists announced that they had solved the mystery that had baffled people for hundreds of years. Earthquakes as weak as -1 on the Richter scale were enough to cause the strange noises. But even while the Mudas Noises did have a scientific explanation, it wasn't good enough for many people. As late as 1989, papers like the New York Times were describing it as just one of many theories. The problem with this explanation for many people was why the swarms of earthquakes were occurring at all. Even taking into account the ancient fault lines, these swarms and the corresponding noises weren't heard anywhere else. A geologist at the time even admitted that it wasn't entirely clear why the tremors were so loud in the Mudas area. Despite these peculiarities, the mystery is considered solved. Those unfamiliar with the noises might find them eerie, but the local people have grown used to the strange sounds. Number 3. It can often be the case that answering one historical mystery only leads to more being uncovered. That was the case when scientists used DNA to try to find out more about who the Teram mummies were and where they came from. The Teram Basin is a region in western China dominated by the Taklamakan Desert. A few rivers come from the surrounding mountains into the basin, only to dry up in the desert. It's an incredibly inhospitable place to live, and it's believed to be one of the last places in Asia that humans inhabited. But it also became home to important stopping points along the Silk Road. The Teram Basin was where Western and Eastern cultures mixed and met. This was mostly felt in the eras when China and the Near East were trade partners, but this blend went much further back. The Teram mummies appeared to be a perfect example of that. The mummies were first discovered by a local hunter in 1910, who later helped a Swedish explorer locate the site, with 330 tombs being found. Many had been robbed in antiquity, but there were still the remains of more than 100 people buried beneath the desert. The remains had been incredibly well preserved due to the dry and salty conditions, which meant their unique features stood out all the more. The Teram mummies were described as being Caucasoid, or Caucasian-like. They had elongated bodies, sunken eyes, long noses, and light-colored hair. This alone seemed to indicate they were distinct from the Asian population that lived in the area at the time. But their clothing and other artifacts were even stranger. They wore clothing made from felt wool and leather, and were buried in boat-shaped coffins with oars as grave markers. One woman was even buried with cheese strung on a necklace, which was later identified as the oldest cheese ever discovered. Another 8 sites have been located over the years, mostly along the eastern or southern edge of the basin. The remains led researchers to believe that this was an isolated group of Indo-Europeans. This revelation led to all sorts of theories, such as the idea that they might have been the descendants of some lost Roman legion. The time for this wouldn't quite fit. The Teram people lived in the area from 2100 to the 1st century BC. They predated ancient Rome and existed for too long to be the result of one small group of lost travelers. It seemed much more likely that this was just the continuation of natural migration. The western edge of the basin marked the known edge of where the Iranian pastoral peoples had reached. It was possible that Western steppe pastoralists had gotten a little further east than was previously understood. The desert would have been a barrier for most pastoralists, but it was clear that the Teram mummies had made it work. Analysis of the mummies found that they'd been consuming dairy from cattle, sheep, and goats for a considerable amount of time. The cheese wasn't buried because it was considered rare. It was basic food for the afterlife. Researchers found that the area had once been a river oasis. Most rivers today dry up in the desert, but when these people lived, snowmelt had been significant enough to sustain rivers that kept the Teram people and their livestock alive. It wasn't quite the same as the Nile or other rivers that sustained ancient civilizations, though. This river would change its course a lot over relatively short periods of time. That meant that no large settlements could be built, but it was enough for the Teram culture to develop. The idea that these people might have originated further west was controversial in China. It was seen as promoting the idea that this region wasn't really a part of China. That meant that research into the mummies, especially by Western researchers, was limited, and they could only speculate about where the Teram people had come from. But in 2021, a groundbreaking study was allowed to take place. The study was a collaboration of Chinese, European, and American researchers. The mummies were so well preserved, even after 4,000 years, that it was possible to extract DNA. DNA from 13 of the oldest mummies was analyzed, as well as DNA from mummies found in the neighboring Zungarian Basin. These mummies dated to between 4,800 and 5,000 years ago, and are the oldest remains in the region. The study would allow researchers to see where the oldest Teram Basin mummies had come from, and if it was a similar place to their neighbors. What they found was shocking. The Zungarian Basin mummies had DNA from Western steppe herders, which was as expected, as well as the local hunter-gatherers. But there was no Western DNA found in the Teram mummies. The Teram mummies were the direct descendants of the ancient North Eurasians, who had lived in an area just slightly north of the basin during the Ice Age. After the Ice Age, the ancient North Eurasians had mostly disappeared. Traces of their DNA can be found in about 50% of the current population. and it was believed that they quickly intermarried with other groups, so were no longer one distinct people. The groups with the most ancient North Eurasian DNA are the indigenous populations of Siberia and the Americas at about 40%. To have found a population with such high levels of ancient North Eurasian DNA was extremely surprising. The Teram people would have had to have been genetically isolated for 6,000 years. This was unlikely to have been by chance, given that the nearby Zungarian people had intermarried with Western steppe herders, so these other groups had definitely reached the region. It was also clear that the Teram mummies were culturally diverse, as well as their Western-style clothing. They had wheat, which also originated from further west, and millet, which could have come from East Asia. Archaeologists also found the medicinal plant ephedra, which originated in Central Asia. These people were connected to many other groups but had DNA from none of them. This raised the question of how this relatively small group of ancient North Eurasians had lasted so long, and why they were genetically isolated. It also isn't clear how long this isolation lasted. Only the oldest mummies were tested. It's possible that the cultural exchange happened very quickly, but it took a few generations for intermarriage and what researchers called admixture to happen. The research also doesn't answer the question of their strange burials. The river was obviously important to them, as is the case in many cultures. But the boat burials were nothing like what archaeologists had found anywhere else in that time period. While the Teram people are interesting due to their blend of different cultures, it's clear that there were some that originated with the Teram themselves. More research into the mummies might help to unravel some more of the mysteries of these people. Number 2. Bouvet Island is the most remote island in the world. The tiny scrap of land is more than 1,600 kilometers from the nearest land, which is the coast of Antarctica. The nearest inhabited land is Bouvet Island, which is 1,845 kilometers away, and inhabited only by the staff of a weather station. The island is also far out of the way of any shipping routes. If someone were to accidentally get stranded on the island, there would be little hope of anybody ever finding them. For most, Bouvet's isolation would be the only interesting thing about the island, but a strange mystery that was found on the isolated land has captured the attention of those who want to solve the unsolved. It wasn't until 2016 that the answer to this strange mystery finally emerged. Bouvet Island was discovered in 1739 by Jean-Baptiste Bouvet, a French explorer. He couldn't land on the island and didn't even circumnavigate it. Bouvet sailed away from the island, believing it was the northernmost tip of Terra Australis. At the time, Europeans believed that there had to be an enormous continent in the southern half of the world to balance out Eurasia. Antarctica hadn't been discovered yet, and Australia, which was then called New Holland, was considered too small to be the landmass that they were looking for. Bouvet placed the new island on the charts but got the precise location wrong. That meant the island was lost again until 1808, when it was spotted and the correct position was mapped. After that, there were a few sporadic visits to the island, but it was so isolated and difficult to find and land on that it didn't receive much attention. It wouldn't be until 1927 when the first extended stay on the island took place. The Norwegian expedition was led by a man named Harald Hornvedt, and they would claim the land for Norway. There wasn't much they could do with the land, though. European explorers weren't against setting up operations on remote islands, if not only so that no other power could claim them, but even that was implausible for Bouvet Island. The island is almost surrounded by cliffs, making landing almost impossible. Those cliffs are then capped by a thick glacier, which covers 93% of the island. The island is also the site of frequent earthquakes. An active volcano sits under the ice sheet. In the late 1950s, landing on the island became slightly easier due to a landslide on the northwest coast. The slide had created a relatively low-lying flat area, which was named Nyrosa. Landing would be possible here, but still extremely difficult. In 1964, a team from South Africa, led by Lieutenant Commander Alan Crawford, made an expedition to the island to look over the new land and see if it was a suitable place for a weather station. The group were dropped by helicopter rather than attempting to land by sea, and came across a strange sight. There was a small lagoon a little more than 100 meters inland. Sitting partially submerged in the lagoon was a wooden lifeboat. The boat was described as seaworthy, but it was unlikely that anybody could use it to get very far. It was 20 feet long and looked heavy, but there was no sail or any sign that it had once had one. There also wasn't a motor. The only way it could be controlled was with the 2 oars found with it. There was very little else found nearby. A copper flotation tank had been flattened out and left nearby, and there were a few pieces of wood, but nothing else. There was nothing to suggest that the boat had been thrown up onto the bank in a storm. There was no other debris around and no damage to the boat. It was far enough inland that it couldn't have been gently washed ashore either. Someone had deliberately pulled the boat on land and left it there. But there were no other signs of humans on the island. Crawford and his team didn't have a lot of time to explore. They were only on Bouvet Island for 45 minutes and had only come to map out the small plateau. The team conducted a quick search for whoever the boat belonged to, but didn't have time to do a more in-depth investigation. They found no sign of any camp and no human remains. It was possible that whoever had brought the boat ashore had gone further inland, but that would have involved scaling the steep cliffs. The area was also prone to landslides, which would have made it very dangerous as well as difficult. The boat had no markings indicating where it had come from, and the copper tank provided no other clues. After 45 minutes on the island, the team left via helicopter, leaving behind a mystery that wouldn't be solved for more than 50 years. Later explanations did not comment on the lifeboat. It's not clear if that's because the boat had vanished in the time since Crawford's visit, or if the expedition just hadn't thought to write about it. What is known is that there was no explanation to try to solve the mystery of the strange lifeboat. The boat had to have come ashore between 1955 and 1964. It's not known when exactly the landslide that created Nyrosa occurred, but it didn't exist during a 1955 expedition. That left 9 years of potential shipwrecks, undocumented expeditions, or some other unlikely accident to have occurred. It seemed unlikely that anybody had made it to Bouvet Island without intending to go there, or at least explore in the region. It was out of the way of any shipping routes. If the lifeboat had come from some cargo ship taking a typical journey across the Atlantic or Indian Oceans, it would have traveled miles to land on the tiny Bouvet Island. The most likely answer was that someone had gone to the island or wanted to explore in the area, and then the lifeboat had either been deliberately or accidentally launched. There were 2 possible expeditions that could have been in the area. One may have been conducted by the Soviets between 1955 and 1957, which was the first Soviet Antarctic expedition. The other was a rumored expedition conducted by a French scientist who claimed to have visited the island to study the wildlife there. It was also possible that some other, even more secretive expedition had taken place. The main problem with this explanation is why they left the boat behind. If they had come ashore on the boat, then they would have had to have left in the boat. There was no explanation for why they had left it, and the flattened copper tank behind. The Soviet expedition seemed like the most promising lead, and in 2016, a Reddit user named Qualis Lebet decided to do some more research into this expedition. They found the answer to the strange mystery. In November of 1958, the whaling ship Slava led a fleet of other vessels on the Antarctic expedition. On November 27th, a group of 10 scientists and sailors went out in Slava 7, a small boat, and landed on Bouvet Island. The exact purpose of their landing isn't clear, but at least one paper about birds observed on the island would come out of the trip. Unfortunately, while they were on land, an unexpected hurricane occurred and they were unable to head back to the main ship in the small wooden boat. The men stayed on the island for 2 days before being rescued by helicopter. The period from November of 1958 to April of 1964 was more than enough time for the harsh weather to remove any identifying marks from the boat. The strange mystery that's been a talking point of Bouvet Island was finally solved. The answer had likely been available for years, though the fact that it appeared in a small Russian research paper meant that it went unnoticed until dedicated sleuths put the pieces together. Number 1. The discovery of Pompei allowed historians and archaeologists to catch a glimpse of what everyday life for an ancient Roman might have looked like. The destruction of the city in a natural disaster meant it remained as a time capsule for centuries before being rediscovered. Hundreds of years before Pompei was destroyed, another natural disaster wiped out the Greek city of Helik in a similar fashion. It inspired a legend and caused a mystery that was only answered in 2012. Helik likely started out in the Bronze Age as a small town with a temple dedicated to the god Poseidon. It sat on the northern coast of the Peloponnesian Peninsula in what would become Archaea. During the classical Greek era, Helik grew in importance. It was still a relatively small city of only around 5,000 residents, but its temple to Poseidon made it very important. We know Poseidon today mostly as the god of the sea, but he was also thought to be responsible for earthquakes. Archaea was located on the coast of a seismically active area, making both of those things very important. The temple to Poseidon was Pan-Hellenic and second only in importance to the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi. As well as the temple, there was a renowned bronze statue of Poseidon with one outstretched arm reaching up to the sky. According to the legend that surrounds Helik, it was this statue that would be the ultimate cause of its downfall. Sometime around 373 BC, Ionian colonists came to Helik and asked to take the statue to Asia Minor. These might have been colonists from Helik itself, as the city did have a colony in Asia Minor, but this wasn't specified. Helik refused the request. The city also refused to give any model of the statue, so the colonists couldn't replicate it elsewhere. According to some versions of the story, the representatives from Ionia had their lives taken. Rather than being impressed that the people of Helik were so dedicated to keeping their statue of him, the actions made Poseidon angry. There were warnings. Columns of flames leapt into the air, and small animals migrated away from the ocean. But the people of Helik didn't realize what was going to come. One night in the winter of 373, a large earthquake shook the city. It was then engulfed by a great wave from the sea and disappeared beneath the water. The next day, 100 men were sent to rescue any survivors, but they could find none. Only the tops of the tallest buildings could be seen above the water. The destruction was blamed on Helik angering Poseidon. Ancient writers recorded that the statue of Poseidon had also been submerged, but its outstretched hand was a hazard for anybody trying to fish with nets above the city. The event would have been a shock to everyone in the surrounding areas. Pompei, years later, would be equally devastating, but Helik had been a religious hub. Its ruin wouldn't just fade from memories. For hundreds of years after the destruction, the city attracted visitors. Ancient Romans would sail above the city, which was still visible. It was something of a tourist destination, much like how sunken cities attract visitors today. But around the 9th century CE, all mentions of Helik stopped, and its location was lost to history. The story of Helik sounded like the stuff of legend, but there were enough independent writers who talked about the city that historians believed it had been a real place. Its ruin likely wasn't caused by an angry sea god, but the seismic activity described was plausible. Finding the lost city became a fascination for underwater archaeologists. Ancient writers had given descriptions of where to find Helik, and the Gulf of Corinth seemed to be a likely location. Countless searches of the sea floor turned up little evidence of the lost city. Sonar surveys eventually ruled out the area, which led to archaeologists scratching their heads. The ancient writers had described the ruins of Helik as being in a small sea passage, but archaeologists realized it could also refer to a lagoon. There were no lagoons in the area, but the landscape had changed a lot in the 2,000 years since Helik had been submerged. Working back to how the landscape would have looked in 373 BC, scholars were able to use the ancient writing to give a general idea of where to search. Surveys of the area turned up Roman buildings dating from the 4th century to the late 1st century BC, and a settlement dating to the Bronze Age. Neither was Helik. It wasn't until 2001 that the city was finally found. The remains of buildings were found in sediments that had been carried by an ancient river and deposited in the lagoon. A number of excavations took place, with the earthquake destruction layer uncovered in 2012. With that, archaeologists were certain that they had located the lost city of Helik. They could also piece together what had happened to the city. An earthquake had caused soil liquefaction, a terrifying phenomenon where the ground suddenly turns into liquid. Recent earthquakes have caused this on a smaller scale, but it's possible that a large enough earthquake could have caused enough soil liquefaction to partially swallow the entire city. The earthquake also triggered a landslide, which caused a tsunami that then swept over what remained of Helik. A shallow lagoon formed in its place, making it the perfect location for ancient tourists curious about their history. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.